Good morning again.
Good morning.
And happy birthday to the love of my life.
Ah,
All righty. I got that in there.
to the love of his life.
All right. So this morning's text for our lesson time is Matthew chapter 13. We'll be in just a little short passage this morning, but hopefully there's some good nuggets we can all take home there. I'll read it first, and then we'll talk about it. Matthew chapter 13, and it's just two verses. Verse 31, 32. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, a grain of mustard seed, that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants, and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. This is the second of only 3 parables that are recorded in all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels, all 3 of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's fascinating to me why, to try to contemplate why the gospel writers chose to write and record what they did, and why this passage, this parable, was chosen out of all Jesus' teaching that they all 3 thought was significant enough to include. Here in Matthew chapter 13 is often referred to as the kingdom discourse. The kingdom discourse, and the reason it's referred to that is that Matthew records 7 of Jesus' parables. Not surprisingly, 7. I mean, Matthew was a Jew. 7 was a significant number to Jews. It was a number that signified completeness. But he recorded the parable of the soils that we talked about last time I was up here. He recorded the parable of the wheat and the weeds. The parable of the mustard seed. The parable of leaven, which is just a single verse. And then he had three more short parables: the treasure in the field, the pearl of great price, and the parable of the net and the fish. And those in each of those, Jesus refers to how it is shaping our understanding of the kingdom of heaven. The end of chapter 13, in the end of chapter 13, verse 52, Matthew records Jesus as having said, "Every scribe," this is chapter 13, verse 52. "Every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out his treasure, what is new and what is old." And as I was reading through, preparing for this discussion, it's like, what is the new and what is the old? As I mentioned before, we just got back from our little trip up to D.C. And up in D.C., there's a lot of things that are old, relatively speaking to us. And there's a lot of things that are new. You go into the art galleries or whatever, and there's a lot of new art, and there's a lot of old art. You go into the history museums, the museums, and there's a great deal of old stuff there. And when I was walking around at my conference, there was a great deal of new stuff. All the guys at the trade show trying to hawk their new stuff. And even when we gather as families, a lot of times, the things that get attention are the new and the old. So if somebody pulls up in a new car, all the guys are going to be out there looking under that hood, checking out the new. Sometimes Grandma will drag out some of the old sacred relics, and everybody sits around and oohs and ahs over the old. So what in this kingdom of heaven discourse, specifically as Jesus is teaching about the grain of mustard seed, is the new and the old. Well, first of all, he speaks about the kingdom of heaven as a kingdom, right? So what is a kingdom? Kingdom is a dominion of the king. That's simple enough. What does that mean? Well, it's where the king reigns. In the time of Christ, during his earthly ministry, I should say, the Jewish people were eagerly anticipating the coming of the kingdom of heaven. David had praised the Lord in Psalm 103. David was one of the first kings over the United Kingdom. He reigned over the united Israel in the early portion of the text. He was anointed king over the United Kingdom, and he praised the Lord that the Lord has established his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom rules over all. So David's reign stretched, it says from Dan to Beersheba, which is like it was almost the whole amount that had been promised to Abraham. And so they saw David's kingdom as kind of the archetype of what the main goal of what they expected Jesus' kingdom of heaven to be, or what the coming kingdom of heaven should be, I should say. However, as the disciples are listening to Jesus' teachings, they're looking around and they're not seeing that. They're seeing the Romans everywhere. They're seeing evidence of the imperial rule of Rome all around them. And they knew that this was not how it was supposed to be. They knew the old scriptures. They knew them really well. They studied them since they were little bitty. They knew passages like where the Zechariah, the priest, who had come back from Babylon some 500 years before this time, they knew that he had proclaimed that the Lord will be king over all the earth. That's Zechariah 14, verse 9. They knew from the scroll of Daniel that when Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and threatened to kill off all of his wise men because they couldn't tell him what the dream was and what the dream meant, that Daniel had been able to reveal to him what the dream was. It was this giant statue, remember, with a head of gold and chest of silver, thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. Daniel could tell him what his dream had been in his own bedroom. And then he further was able to tell him what those symbols meant, what that statue meant. It was the kingdoms that were to come. And we're not going to go through that in great detail. But that there was also to come a stone that would be cut out, not by human hands, and that would crush those feet of iron and clay. And so people could count, right? They could count the different kingdoms that had been ruling over Palestine. And they knew that there was a coming kingdom, a stone that would crush the Romans, and that it would set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. That's Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. And so those passages were deep in their psyche. They knew later on in Daniel himself had a vision of the 4 terrible beasts. And those also represented the 4 great empires that were going to rule over the known world at that time. And that they would eventually, the Son of Man, there in Daniel 7, would reign with the Ancient of Days, and his would be the dominion and glory, and a kingdom that all people and nations and languages should serve him, and that his dominion is an everlasting dominion. That's from Daniel chapter 7, verse 14. Not only that, but they knew that the greatest of those under the whole heavens shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, and that their kingdom, also there in Daniel 7, shall be an everlasting kingdom, and that all dominions shall serve and obey them. But there's this, yes, the Son of Man was coming to reign. Yes, he was the stone cut out not by human hands that was going to crush the feet of the statue, crush the Romans, but that they would be included in that dominion. And that's Daniel 7, verse 27. So when Jesus comes and he starts teaching that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, we have that recorded in several of the Gospels, but in Mark 1, verse 15 is one of the places that were recorded that Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Their ears would have perked up, and they would have said, oh, what's going on here? Is this what we think it is? He also begins referring to himself as the Son of Man. They understandably would have gotten excited that they were going to be out from under this crushing, oppressive rule of the feet and clay of Rome. The God who had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, the God who had led them through the wilderness and given them manna in the wilderness, the God who had given them the promised land after they had spent a generation there in the wilderness. And then he had continued to bring them through redemption cycle after redemption cycle during the time of the judges. That same God was going to do it again. He was going to help them. He's going to come in power and throw off the oppressive government. It's understandable why they would be confused when Jesus taught in his Sermon on the Mount that the poor in spirit, that they should be happy, because it would be theirs to have the kingdom of heaven. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven, Jesus says there in Matthew 5. Or later in the same Beatitudes, that many of you probably remember, that those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, that they are blessed because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What? We're supposed to be having this stone cut out not by human hands, crushing the feet of iron and clay. What? So why, here in this kingdom discourse, here in Matthew 13, would Jesus compare the kingdom of heaven to all this agriculture? Why did Matthew, Mark, and Luke all find it necessary, find it useful to record this brief parable that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed? Well, the easy answer there is that, well, the Spirit encouraged them to. The Spirit led them to, inspired them. That's the easy answer. It doesn't really get us, it gets us the whole direction. It gets us the whole distance, really. But it's also, at the same time, somehow not very satisfying. Right? Spirit inspired them to do it. That's the place. But the Spirit of God is not one to waste. He's not wasteful in any way. Even if we think that it is being wasteful to record in 3 times, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, that's just wasteful. Jesus explains that he chose the mustard seed for basically 2 reasons, right? It became, because of its small size, the seed is a tiny little seed, one of the smallest that they would have used in any routine way in their gardens. It's a tiny little seed, but it also grows. It grows into a large plant that they would have considered a tree. It would have been, probably 10 feet tall. It's part of the brassica species, the brassica nigrums, they think, the black mustard. It grows to a tree about 10 feet tall. The kingdom of heaven was going to start with just a humble beginning. The God of all creation had chosen, he could have chosen any way he wanted to come into this world, right? He's the God of all creation. And yet, the way that he chose to come in was in a poor family. A young, engaged couple without even enough money to be able to have a room in an inn. They couldn't even afford, to buy a lamb for their sacrifice later on when they went to the temple. He was raised in a family that was on the run from a tyrant king. They were displaced. They were displaced people, aliens in a foreign land in Egypt for part of his childhood, and then ultimately to grow up in a backwater community where nothing good could come from. Those are humble beginnings for the King to come, for the God of all creation to come into his world. But the kingdom was meant to grow. That's the other part of the illustration, right? The kingdom was meant to grow. Is to grow in a garden, he says, into a tree, he says. Well, those images, surely they were to encourage them to remember the first garden. And in the middle of that first garden, there was what? There was a tree of life that God had placed in his garden. It should be on basically the first page of your text. God had placed the first humans, and he told them to be fruitful and multiply. And he gave them the seeds and the fruit of the trees to eat. And everything was abundant. The seeds, there was no competition between the humans and the animals, because the animals were given the leafy plants. So they got all the grass and lettuces, and the man got the seeds and the fruit. So there was no competition. There was abundance. Those seeds and the seed of the mustard seed, they contain the elements of life. They contain a little embryo, a germ. They contain, the reserved nutrients that seed needs as it's germinating. And then it's all kept in a nice protective coat. And that seed can sit and be dormant until the right conditions are reached. John, we haven't talked about John much today, but in John chapter 12, Jesus teaches about a different seed, a seed of a wheat in that situation. But he shows that it's only when that seed that contains the germ of life, the embryo, that little reserved nutrients, it's only when it falls into the earth and dies. And that's the only time it starts to have any fruit come from it. When it dies, it bears much fruit. There in John 12. And this is to illustrate the fact that we ourselves die as we submit to his will. We submit our will to his will. That's a form of death to self. If we want to follow him, partake of him, or abide in him, as John records Jesus calling us to there in John 15, then we have to die to ourselves. That tree of life that I mentioned that God placed in his garden, there on the first page of your text, is also on the last page of your text. The writer of Revelation, John, describes in Revelation 22 that the river of life feeding the tree of life, the same tree in the new creation there. Psalm 1, just turn there. I'm trying to go from my notes, but my notes are kind of messy. In Psalm 1, the psalmist says, speaking about the righteous, he says, he is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in season, and its leaf does not wither. So we are being called to be like that tree of life, planted by the streams of water. And what is the streams of water? The streams of water, the tree there is drawing nourishment from the Spirit. We can clearly understand that streams of water was intended to mean the Spirit, because in Isaiah 44, Isaiah makes it very clear that it is the Spirit who nourishes and gives the water. And it's as a result of drawing nourishment from the Spirit of God that we are intended to grow. We're intended to send our roots deep and to drink deep of the Spirit. And we're to spread out our branches to offer shade and protection to those around us. Now, we can't force our own growth any more than a tree can force its own growth. God gives the growth. But we can earnestly seek the gifts of the Spirit. 1 Corinthians 12:29, you can earnestly seek the gifts of the Spirit. Why? Why? So that we can bless the body, so that we can love our neighbors as ourselves. In the parable of the mustard seed, there, we also should notice that all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of them record the fact that the kingdom of heaven has branches. The kingdom of heaven has branches? The kingdom of heaven, the true vine that John refers to in John 15, they all have branches. The kingdom of heaven is not made up of boards that are machined to a dimensional lumber by some sort of man-made systematic theology. The kingdom of heaven is organic. And those branches stand or fall because of their attachment to Christ alone. Now, he does prune. He'll send his angels to weed the garden or weed the field there in Matthew 13. So if we're not fruitful, he does prune his branches and he does weed his fields. But we're called to build up the one body, as we read from Ephesians this morning, build up the one body of Christ, emphasizing our common adherence to one God and Father, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one Spirit, and the one baptism that he brings, the Spirit brings. As we consider the concept that the kingdom of heaven is here to bless, provide nourishment, provide shade and shelter, there's a lot of opportunities there. There's a lot of opportunities. So as we go forth from here today, and really every day, as we seek to be known as Christians, we need to be known for our love for one another, so that Christ will be glorified, and so that his kingdom will continue to grow. And that growth, just be reminded, is because of your attachment to Christ and his nourishment through the Spirit. If there's any that are here this morning that need to respond and be buried with Christ in baptism, if there's any that need to come and join together in prayer together over something that you may want to pray about, we'd love to try to encourage or support you in any way that we can. This is not the only time by any means. Any of us are available basically anytime. If there's any needs that you have, don't hesitate to let us know. But this is a convenient time. If you'd like to join together, come now as we stand and as we sing.